I have ruled Valdenmoor for 11 years, and in those 11 years I have never knelt in the snow for anyone. I am telling you this now because it matters. Because if you do not understand the kind of man I was before that morning at Keldrath Pass, the iron-governed, granite-hearted kind, the kind who had long since decided that kneeling was something other men did, then you will not understand what it meant when I did it. You will not understand why I stayed down. I found her 2 miles east of the ambush site, propped against a pine tree so old its bark had gone silver, packing her own wound with what I would later learn was yarrow and crushed spruce resin. She was conscious. That was the first thing. The second thing was that she looked at me, at my cloak, at the mark on my chest, at the 6 wolves flanking me through the trees. And her first words were not "Who are you?" or "Please help me," or even "I think I'm dying." Her first words were, "Are your runners alive?" I have thought about that question every day since. 3 weeks before I found her, I was standing at the window of my study in the black stone keep of Valdenmoor, reading a dispatch that should not have existed. Valdenmoor is a northern kingdom. If you have heard of it at all, you have heard it described as cold, severe, difficult to reach, and even more difficult to leave, which is largely accurate. We are not a kingdom of ceremony and candlelight. We are a kingdom of ridgeline fortifications and pine forests and supply roads that the winter tries to swallow every year and that we rebuild, stubbornly, every spring. The great keep sits on a ridge of black granite above the valley, and from my study window on a clear day, I can see 30 miles of those roads unspooling northward through the trees, and I have spent 11 years watching them the way a farmer watches the sky, looking for the thing that will ruin everything before it arrives. The dispatch was from my second-in-command, Aldrich, who had the manner of a man who had been personally offended by the concept of uncertainty his entire life. 3 supply runners, the dispatch read. The northern road, the Keldrath corridor, missed their report window by 48 hours. Scouts sent. No bodies found. No wolves. No cargo. Road shows signs of a scatter. The runners split and ran rather than stood and fought, which is unlike them. A border woman was found on the road near the Keldrath Pass 2 days prior by a logging crew claiming to have witnessed armed men at the pass. Crew brought her to the Keldrath way station. Her account has been noted. She has no pack affiliation, no identifying marks, no wolf form, no standing to make a formal report to the keep. Assessment: likely opportunist seeking shelter. Scouts continuing north. Will report by nightfall. I read that dispatch 3 times. The part that stayed with me was not the missing runners. Runners went missing. Roads in the Keldrath corridor were dangerous in winter, ice, elevation, the occasional organized raider who thought distance from the keep meant safety. What stayed with me was the border woman, the way Aldrich had written her off in 3 sentences. No pack affiliation, no wolf form, no standing, as though those 3 absences explained everything about her and left nothing worth examining. I sent a reply, "Send me the woman's exact account, word for word." Aldrich's reply came before nightfall. I could feel his reluctance in the phrasing, the slight tightening of formality that meant he thought I was wasting my attention. The account he sent was brief. A woman traveling alone on the northern road, name given as Marin, no pack name offered, stated occupation as traveling herbalist. Claims to have seen 6 armed men, no pack colors, taking up position in the trees at the south end of the Keldrath Pass 2 days ago at approximately midday. Claims she spent 1 night watching them to be certain of their number and position before flagging the logging crew at first light. Could not explain why she did not simply leave the road and avoid the pass herself. No injuries. Currently at the way station. Requesting instruction on whether to detain. I read it once. Then I put on my cloak, went to the stables and rode north. Aldrich caught up with me at the valley fork, his horse breathing hard, his expression the particular combination of resignation and affront that meant he had long since stopped trying to talk me out of things, but had not stopped wanting to. "My lord," he said, falling into pace beside me, The scouts are handling this. The scouts are looking for bodies, I said. I'm looking for something else. The woman is. I know what you think of the woman. He was quiet for a moment, which was its own kind of argument. She has no standing, he said finally. No pack, no wolf form. If she had information about raiders at the pass, the correct thing to do was flag it and move on, which by her own account she did. There is nothing further. She watched them for a full night, I said. Alone in the dark in the trees in winter to count them correctly. She didn't run, she didn't guess, she made sure. Aldrich said nothing. Tell me the last scout who did that, I said. He didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer to give. We rode the rest of the way to Keldrath in silence. The pass at Keldrath is a long corridor of ice and compressed snow between two ridges of pine, narrow enough that 2 carts can barely pass and wide enough that 6 armed men in the tree line could cover the whole road from both sides. It is the kind of place that experienced raiders choose not because it's ideal, but because it's the only option on that stretch of road. Nowhere else for 30 miles gives you that angle. My scouts had been through the pass twice since the runner's disappearance. They'd found what they'd reported, the evidence of a scatter, signs of a fight begun and then broken off in a strange direction, boot prints in the snow that didn't match any of my runners, and had no clean narrative attached to them. No bodies, no blood where the blood should have been at the center of the road, where an ambush would have met them head-on. The blood was in the tree line, left side about 40 feet from the road. I crouched beside the snow and looked at it for a long time. My wolf is not a demonstrative creature. He is old and quiet and has spent 11 years in a body that has trained him to stillness. When I was 20 and my counsel told me to stand at the moon ceremony and wait for the bond to ignite, he had stood with me for 4 hours in the cold and nothing had happened, and afterward he had settled down inside me like a dog going to sleep, patient and resigned, and I had decided that was simply who we were. A king without a fated mate. It happened. I had built an entire kingdom around that fact. But crouching there in the tree line at Keldrath, looking at blood in the snow that should not have been where it was, my wolf got up. It wasn't fire. It wasn't the great surge that the songs describe, the howling recognition. It was more like a compass needle swinging. Slow, deliberate, absolutely certain. Northeast. 2 miles, maybe a little more. I stood up. The runners were here, I said, to no one in particular. One of my scouts was standing at the edge of the tree line, and he looked at me with the careful neutrality men develop when their alpha is doing something they can't explain. Someone drew the attack sideways, pulled it into the trees, away from the road. The runners got the scatter signal and ran. My lord, the blood isn't theirs. I looked at the compass direction my wolf was pointing. Start the wounded runner talking. I want to know exactly what he saw. I walked northeast into the trees. The runner's name was Bren. He was 23 years old and had been riding the Keldrath run for 2 years, and he told my scout afterward that he had seen exactly this. The ambush had begun clean, the way ambushes do, with the sudden appearance of men from the trees and the first shout of hold and dismount. His first instinct had been to scatter, which was procedure, split the group so not all of them could be taken. But before he could give the signal, a woman had stepped out of the tree line from the wrong side of the road. Not a wolf, not a fighter. A small, brown-haired woman in a gray traveling cloak, with a herbalist's satchel still on her back, who walked directly into the space between his runners and the armed men, and did the only thing that could possibly have bought his people enough time to scatter. She made herself the problem. She shouted. She threw something, a jar, as it turned out, a glass jar of something that shattered on the nearest attacker's chest, and proved to be a tincture of winterbark resin, which is deeply non-toxic but smelled, in the cold morning air, extremely convincingly like something flammable. She moved toward them rather than away, which was so unexpected that it broke the formation's coherent attention for exactly long enough. And then the closest man had turned on her, and she had taken the strike on her shoulder, and Bren had given the scatter signal, and they had run. He hadn't seen what happened next. He'd been running. She was 2 miles northeast of the pass, against a pine so old it looked like part of the landscape. The late afternoon light was already going thin and pale through the trees, the kind of winter light that has given up trying to warm anything and is simply fulfilling its obligation. The snow around her was disturbed. She had moved at some point, or been moved by the wind, or had tried to stand and decided against it. And she was sitting with her back against the bark and her right hand pressed to her left shoulder, and she was conscious. That was the first thing. The second was the yarrow. She'd unpacked part of her herbalist's satchel and was working one-handed, pressing a poultice of dried yarrow, and something I smelled before I could identify it, spruce resin. I would learn, which has analgesic properties that most field healers don't bother with because it's difficult to harvest cleanly. She'd harvested it. She'd packed it in her satchel before she ever got to Keldreth, because she was the kind of person who prepared for things. I walked out of the tree line and she heard me, or heard the wolves more likely, 3 of them coming through the snow on my right, and she looked up. She looked at my cloak. She looked at the mark on my chest, which is the Valdenmoor sigil and which is large and deliberately unmistakable. She looked at the wolves. She looked at my face. And then she said, "Are your runners alive?" I stopped walking. "Are they alive?" she said again. Her voice was even, not weak, steady in the way that takes real effort to maintain, the kind of steady that is a decision rather than a circumstance. "The ones from the road, I didn't see them run. I was occupied." "They're alive," I said. She closed her eyes for one moment, then opened them. "Good," she said. "That's good." I walked to her and crouched down in the snow, and the mark on my wrist, the mark that had been blank skin for 34 years, that I had long since stopped looking at, burned to life. I have tried in the weeks since to describe what that felt like. I have found that I cannot do it justice with the vocabulary I have, which is a king's vocabulary, precise, functional, built for orders and dispatches, and the occasional hard truth delivered to people who do not want to hear it. The songs describe the mate bond as fire. I have heard them. Great howling fire, they say, the blaze of recognition. I am not saying the songs are wrong. I am saying that what I felt, crouching in the snow beside a woman who had just asked me if my runners were alive before she asked me for help, was not quite fire. It was more like coming home to a house you didn't know you had. The mark on my wrist was burning, genuinely burning, a heat that radiated up my arm and into my chest and didn't hurt the way a burn hurts, hurt the way a long-held tension finally releasing hurts, the ache of something that has been held too tight for too long finally allowed to breathe. My wolf, who had been pointing northeast with compass certainty for the last 2 miles, simply settled, not like an animal lying down, like a compass needle finding true north and stopping. She was watching me. I realized I had been staring at my wrist, and I looked up at her, and she was watching my face with an expression I would come to know well in the weeks that followed, the expression of a woman who has encountered something that doesn't fit her current understanding of how the world works, and is methodically rearranging her understanding, rather than insisting on the old one. "That," she said carefully, "is a mate mark." "Yes." "On the king of Valdenmoor." "Yes." She looked at her own wrist. I looked too. The mark was there, not the Valdenmoor sigil, but its mirror shape, the complementary form that appears on a fated mate when the bond ignites, the one that had appeared on no one's wrist in my kingdom in living memory. It was bright against her skin, luminous in the pale winter light. "I don't," she began and stopped, started again. "I'm not pack. I have no wolf form. I'm a border herbalist. I move between villages and I stitch things and I leave. I don't." She looked up at me again. "I don't know what you're supposed to do with that." "Neither do I," said, which was the most honest thing I had said in a very long time. Is it possible it's a mistake? No, I said. She looked at the mark on her wrist again. Then she looked at the snow. Then she looked at me. Well, she said, with a pragmatism that undid me completely, I suppose we can think about it somewhere warmer. I carried her out of the forest. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters here. I carried her not because she couldn't have walked, she was injured but functional, had been walking and moving through a pine forest in winter with a shoulder wound long enough to find that tree and treat herself, but because it was the only thing my wolf would permit me to do. Every other option felt like an abdication of something I couldn't name yet. My second in command was waiting at the tree line, and he took one look at the mark on my wrist, and did not say a single word about border women with no standing, which I appreciated. She didn't protest being carried. She also didn't soften into it the way I'd seen, the way you'd expect someone to, being held by the alpha king in full view of his wolves and his second, and the late winter light going gold over the pines. She stayed alert. She kept her satchel on her own shoulder. Halfway back to the horses she said, in a conversational tone, I have winter moss in the lower left pocket that needs to be kept level or the oil separates. I'm carrying you level, I said. You tilted left when you stepped over that root. The winter moss is fine. I'm just noting. The winter moss, I said, is fine. A pause, then quietly, thank you for coming out here. You drew the attack sideways, I said. You shielded strangers you had no obligation to shield. I would have come farther than 2 miles. She didn't answer that. I could feel her thinking. They were in trouble, she said finally, as though this explained everything. As though it were the entire and sufficient reason, the only one needed, the one that made all the other questions unnecessary. I thought about that for the rest of the ride back. We reached the keep at nightfall. I want to tell you what it looked like from the gate, because Aldrich told me afterward and I have been carrying the image since. He said the gates opened, and the King of Valdemar rode in carrying a woman he had not had an hour ago, a small woman in a gray cloak with a herbalist's satchel, and 3 wolves came through the gates beside him that had never walked a voluntary step alongside anyone they weren't bonded to, and the whole courtyard simply stopped. Aldrich said he had been in service to Valdemar for 19 years, and he had never seen the inner wolves choose to walk escort without being commanded. He said they walked in a loose triangle around my horse the whole way from the gates to the keep steps, which is the formation they use for the alpha himself on formal occasions. He said the mark on my wrist was visible even from the far end of the courtyard. He told me this later because at the time I wasn't watching the courtyard. I was watching her watch the keep, the black stone of it, the torchlight on the walls, the height of the gate arch, with the same methodical attention she gave everything, cataloging it, filing it, trying to understand where she'd arrived. It's very tall, she said. It is. And very black. It's the local granite, I said. There's iron in it, makes everything look severe. Does it bother you? I hadn't thought about it in years. I grew up here, I said. It looks like home. She considered this. I grew up in a village with white birch logs, she said. Everything was pale. I sometimes had to remind myself to look at the shadows to know where I was. And now I mostly know where I am, she said, still looking at the keep. It just takes me a moment. I brought her inside. The keep's healer, a woman named Ossie, silver-haired and unimpressed by rank, who had been managing Valdemar's infirmary since before I was born, took one look at the shoulder wound, one look at the poultice already packed into it, and said, with the air of someone revising a prior assumption, "You did this yourself." "One-handed," Marin said. "Spruce resin. It slows the bleed and numbs the surface layer. Most people don't bother because it's difficult to harvest clean," Ossie said. "I know I bother." A pause. "What concentration?" 4 parts resin to 1 part rendered tallow. left to solidify in the cold before application. Ossie looked at her for a long moment, then she looked at me. Then she looked at the mark on my wrist, and then at the mark on Marin's wrist, and something in her face shifted, something old and quiet and deeply satisfied, the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to stop being surprised by what destiny did and had started simply being glad when it arrived. "Sit," she told Marin. "I'll clean this properly and you can tell me where you studied." "I didn't study anywhere formal," Marin said, sitting. "I learned by doing." "That's almost always better," Ossie said, and began to work, and I stood in the doorway because leaving felt like something I was incapable of. Here is what I learned about Marin in the days that followed, which I tell you in this order because it is the order in which I learned it, and the order matters. The first thing, she had no pack because she had never wanted one. This was not bitterness or exile. She had simply left her birth village at 19 with her mother's herbalist kit and her own hard-won skill, and had spent 6 years moving between settlements, treating what needed treating, and leaving when the work was done. She was not wolfless by birth. She had a wolf form, had shifted 3 times in her life, and found the experience interesting but not particularly relevant to how she wanted to spend her time. Her wolf, she explained, was quiet and not especially opinionated, which made me think that her wolf and my wolf might get along. The second thing, she had not planned to intercede at Keldrath. She had been watching the armed men at the pass for a full night and had calculated correctly that flagging the logging crew and hoping the warning reached the supply runners in time was the probable failure option, and that there was one other option which had a better chance of working. She had applied that same methodical logic to her own body and decided the risk was acceptable. She said this with the matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, which was the tone of someone who had made peace with the gap between what the world owed her and what she was going to do anyway. I asked her if she had been frightened. She thought about it for a moment. "Yes," she said, "but being frightened and doing the thing are not mutually exclusive. They coexist. You manage them." "Most people let the frightened one win," I said. "I know," she said. "I've never been able to explain why I don't." The third thing, which I did not learn from her directly, but pieced together from the logging crew's account, from Bren's account, from the scout who had first found her at the way station and written her off in Aldrich's dispatch, was this. She had been at the way station for 2 days before I sent north. In those 2 days she had treated the 3 injuries the logging crew had brought in from a cart accident on the upper road, splinted a child's broken wrist at the way station keeper's request, and identified a rot in the way station's food stores that would have sickened everyone there within a week if it had gone unnoticed. She had done all of this for nothing, in a way station that wasn't her home, among people she had never met, because the work was there and she knew how to do it. When I asked her about it, she seemed faintly puzzled by the question. "The work was there," she said, "and I knew how to do it." I had thought I understood after Keldrath what kind of person she was. I had thought, she is brave and brave in a particular way, the kind that calculates and decides rather than the kind that charges without thinking. But it was those 2 days at the way station that finished the picture for me. She wasn't just brave in the crisis. She was simply, consistently, in every ordinary moment, the person who did the thing that needed doing and asked nothing back. I had governed a kingdom for 11 years. I had met leaders, warriors, diplomats, traders, healers. I had met people of extraordinary capability and extraordinary courage. I had not, until the pine forest at Keldrath, met someone who was both of those things and also entirely without performance. The wolves noticed before I could have put it into words. Valdenmoor has 11 inner wolves, the great bonded animals that live in the keep, that are not pets and not merely guard animals but something older and more particular. The wolves that the old stories say are the living record of the pack's bloodline and the bond between the land and the alpha who rules it. They are selective to a degree that has frustrated every guest, every council member, every visiting dignitary I have ever hosted. They tolerate. They do not, as a rule, choose. They chose Marin on the second morning. I know because Ossie came to find me in my study with an expression on her face that was trying very hard to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. She told me that the morning patrol had found 3 of the inner wolves sitting outside the infirmary door. Not scratching, not howling, sitting in the same loose triangle they had used coming through the gates, as though they had simply decided to install themselves there and were waiting for confirmation. I went to the infirmary. Marin was sitting in the window seat with the 3 wolves arranged around her, one on the floor at her feet, one on the bench beside her, one standing at the window looking out at the courtyard with the proprietary air of an animal that has accepted responsibility for a perimeter, and she was drinking tea and looking at her own wrist. "They were here when I woke up," she said. "I know. Is this normal?" "No," I said. "The inner wolves don't do this." "They do now, apparently." She looked at the one at her feet, which was looking back at her with an expression of absolute determination. I asked the large one to leave. He disagreed. I sat down across from her. The wolves rearranged themselves subtly to make room, the way they made room for me. "How's the shoulder?" I said. "Better. Ossie's good. She's been doing this for 40 years. It shows." A pause. "She told me this morning what the inner wolves choosing someone means in the old stories." She looked at her wrist again. "She said it means the bond is, she said it means it's not ambiguous." "It isn't ambiguous," I said. "I know, I've been sitting here thinking about it." She looked up at me. "I don't know how to be Pac. I've never been Pac. I don't know the rhythms of it, the obligations, the hierarchy. I've always been," she gestured vaguely, "a small precise movement outside of all of that, moving through it but not in it." "You shielded strangers with no obligation to shield them," I said. "You treated injuries in a way station you weren't asked to stay at. You watched armed men through a full night in the cold because you wanted to be sure. You already know how to be responsible for people." She thought about this. "That's different," she said. "That's just responding to what's in front of you." "That's what being Pac is," I said. "At its foundation, responding to what's in front of you with everything you have." She looked at the wolf at her feet. It was still looking at her with that absolute determination, the way the inner wolves looked at me when they were making a point. "I'm told," she said slowly, "that you ruled alone for 11 years, after the ceremony." She glanced at me. "That you decided the bond wasn't going to happen and you built the kingdom around that." "Yes." "And now you're," she looked at the mark on her wrist, and then at the mirror of it on mine, "adjusting." "Yes." "Is that difficult?" I considered the question seriously, because she deserved a serious answer. 11 years of running a kingdom alone," I said, "has made me very good at running a kingdom alone. I imagine some adjustments will be required." "I'm not very," she searched for the word, "biddable," she said. "I've been told this. I have my own ways of doing things, and I find it difficult to adopt other people's ways when I believe my own ways are correct." "So do I said. "That seems like it might cause problems." "Or," I said, "it means we'll understand each other." She looked at me for a long moment. The wolf at her feet shifted, settling more firmly, as though deciding this conversation was taking the right direction and it could relax. "I need to think," she said. "Take all the time you need," I said. I meant it. I want to be clear about that, because the songs about mate bonds do not always make clear that it is possible to mean it. To feel the bond burning in your wrist and the compass needle certainty in your chest, and the wolves rearranging themselves around the 2 of you and still, genuinely, mean take all the time you need. I meant it because she had just spent 6 years being the person who made her own decisions, and the bond does not change who a person is. It only adds something. I got up and left her to think. What I did with my time while she thought is perhaps instructive. I had a kingdom to run, which had not stopped requiring running simply because I had ridden north to find a woman in the snow. The missing runner's situation needed formal resolution. The raider group that had staged the Keldrath ambush was still somewhere in the northern corridor, and my scouts had been tracking them for 5 days with limited success. There were the usual winter dispatches. The road crews reporting 2 washouts on the eastern approach, a grain shipment delayed by ice at the Valley Ford, a territorial dispute between 2 pack families in the southern reach that had been simmering since autumn and was beginning to smell like something that would need my personal attention before spring. I handled all of this. I held my morning council. I signed dispatches. I reviewed the scouts' tracking reports and gave orders that would, within 4 days, result in the raider group being found sheltering in an abandoned mill 14 miles north of Keldrath, where they would surrender without a fight to a force of 20 Valdenmoor wolves, who had been given very clear instructions about what the Alpha King wanted done with them. I also, 3 times on the first day and twice on the second, walked past the infirmary and found reasons to stop. The first time, Marin was working with Ossie on a new preparation, something to do with the winter moss she'd been carrying in her satchel, which Ossie had never used in that application and was apparently deeply interested in. They were talking with the focused, rapid-fire shorthand of 2 people who have discovered they share a professional language, and neither of them noticed me in the doorway. I stood there for approximately 30 seconds, which was approximately 30 seconds longer than any king of Valdenmoor had previously stood in a doorway watching 2 healers argue about winter moss, and then I went back to my dispatches. The second time she was alone at the window looking out at the courtyard. The inner wolf was still at her feet. I knocked at the open door, which was perhaps excessive in my own keep, but seemed right, and she looked over. I was wondering, I said, if you wanted anything to eat, or anything. A slight pause. I would like, she said carefully, to know what the raider group situation is, the ones from the pass. I told her. She listened with complete attention, asked 2 precise questions, how many, and had anyone traced the origin point, and nodded at the answers. Good, she said, that's being handled properly. I have some experience with handling things properly, I said. I know, she said. I've been reading about you. Ossie has a history of the keep, a beat. You've made significant improvements to the northern road system. The roads needed improving. They did, she agreed. The Keldrath corridor in particular was dangerously narrow at the south end before your expansion in year 7. If it had still been narrow at the south end, the raider position at the pass would have been almost impossible to break. The fact that the runners had room to scatter is partly because of the road work. I had genuinely never considered that chain of events before, and the fact that she had traced it, sitting in a keep window with a shoulder wound and a history book, was so completely characteristic of her that I stood in the doorway for a moment in something that was not quite speechlessness, but was adjacent to it. Go handle your kingdom, she said, not unkindly. I'm still thinking. I went to handle my kingdom. On the 3rd morning she found me. I was in the great hall reviewing the latest tracking report when I heard the wolves shift. Not the alarm shift, the other one. The subtle ripple of attention that means someone of consequence to the pack has entered the room. And I looked up and she was standing at the far end of the hall, 3 inner wolves arranged behind her, her left arm in a linen sling and her right hand carrying what appeared to be a cloth-covered tray. Ossie says you don't eat properly when you're working on dispatches, she said, starting toward me across the stone floor with the same deliberate, unhurried pace she used for everything. She asked me to bring this. Ossie has been managing my eating habits since I was 12, I said. She mentioned that. She reached the table, set the tray down, pulled back the cloth, bread, cold roast, something in a small jar that turned out, when I opened it, to be the spruce resin and winter moss preparation she and Ossie had been working on for 2 days. "That's for your wrist," she said. "The mark burns when it's new. The preparation helps." I looked at the jar, and then at the mark on her wrist, and then at her. "Does yours burn?" I said. "Sometimes," she said. "Less than it did." She sat down across from me, which was the only chair at that end of the table, and arranged her sling with the particular economy of movement she used when she was managing pain and not drawing attention to it. "I've been thinking." "I know. I want to tell you what I concluded, because I think you've been waiting to know, and also because I believe in being direct." "I appreciate that," I said. She looked at me steadily. "I've spent 6 years making my own decisions," she said. "I'm not going to stop doing that. If I think something is wrong medically, practically, ethically, I'll say so. I won't defer to rank when I believe rank is incorrect. I'll be difficult about this probably fairly regularly." "I expect nothing less," I said. "I don't know how to be Luna. I don't know the ceremonies or the protocols or how you run your council meetings or what the pack expects of a mate." "You'll learn," I said. "I'll help you." "I'm a fast learner," she said. "But I'll make mistakes." "So will I said. "I've been making them for 11 years with no one to tell me." Something shifted in her face at that, not softening exactly, but the very slight loosening of a tension she had been holding, the adjustment of someone who had been prepared for a more difficult answer and was recalibrating. "The wolves have decided," she said. "The wolves decided on the first morning." "I know, they're very certain." She looked at the wolf sitting beside her, which was looking back at her with the same absolute determination it had been employing since it stationed itself outside the infirmary. "I find I'm inclined to trust their judgment." "They've never been wrong," I said. "Have they chosen someone before?" "No," I said, "in 11 years. "No." She was quiet for a moment, then she looked at the preparation she'd set on the table. "The wrist," she said. "Let me see." I put my arm across the table. She opened the jar and applied the preparation with the same focused precision she used for everything. The same one-handed efficiency, the same lack of ceremony, the same matter-of-fact thoroughness. The burn on my wrist eased. "Does that help?" she said. "Yes," I said, "thank you." She didn't release my wrist immediately. She looked at the mark, at its lines, its shape, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "About responding to what's in front of you, about that being what pack is at the foundation." "Yes. I think I can do that," she said. "I've been doing it my whole life. I just didn't have a name for it." "Most people," I said, "who are good at something don't have a name for it. They just do it." She looked up at me. "I want to be useful," she said. "I mean that specifically. Not decorative, not ceremonial. Useful. I want to keep working. The northern settlements need healers, real ones, not just pack members who have learned the basics. I've seen what happens when villages don't have anyone who can handle a complicated birth or a bad infection or a poisoning. I want to keep doing that work." "I would never ask you to stop," I said. "Some would." "I'm not some," I said. She considered this. Then she did something she had not done before in any of our interactions since the pine forest. She turned my hand over in hers, deliberate and unhurried, and looked at the mark on my wrist from the underside, and then looked at the matching mark on her own wrist. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a ceremony. It was a woman who had spent 6 years making her own decisions, making one more. "All right," she said again, and she did not let go of my hand. "I should tell you about the council meeting, because Aldrich told me later that it was the most eventful council meeting in 11 years of his service, and I think he is probably right. I called it 3 days after the morning in the great hall. I had reasons to wait. Her shoulder needed more time. The raiders needed to be formally resolved, and I wanted her to have eaten Ossie's food and slept in a warm room for several consecutive nights before I put her in front of 8 men who had spent 11 years growing accustomed to having the Alpha King entirely to themselves. But there were dispatches that required the council's attention and decisions that could not wait longer. And also, I had decided that waiting was not going to make any of this easier. She wore gray, which was what she had, and did not appear to find this insufficient. She came into the council chamber with the inner wolves. All 3 of them had abandoned any pretense of neutrality and were simply accompanying her now, which had caused a certain amount of quiet rearrangement of assumptions throughout the keep. And she sat in the chair I had placed to my right, and she put her satchel under the chair the way she put it everywhere, and she looked at the 8 men looking at her with the same methodical calm she brought to everything. Aldrich, to his credit, had spoken to me the previous evening. "My lord," he had said, in the careful tone he used when he was about to say something he suspected I already knew, "the council will have questions." "I know. Her standing," I said, "is the mate bond of the Alpha King of Valdenmoor and the unanimous choice of the inner wolves. I am open to arguments about how that fails to constitute sufficient standing." He had not offered any. In the council chamber, the first question from my Southern Reach counselor, a man named Ferris who had a gift for stating what other people were delicately avoiding, was direct. "The mark is genuine." "The mark is genuine," I said. "And she has no wolf form." "She has a wolf form," Marin said from my right, in the conversational tone she used for statements of fact. "I've shifted 3 times. I find it less practically useful than my work, so I don't prioritize it. If the council requires a demonstration, I'm willing, though I'd prefer to wait until the shoulder is fully healed, as I don't know how the shift will interact with the joint." A brief silence. "That won't be necessary," Ferris said, in a slightly different tone than the one he'd started with. "She treated the runner's injuries at the way station," said my Northern Reach counselor, whose name was Haddon, and who had come to the meeting already knowing this, because his territory included the Keldrath corridor. Before she was known to the keep, she identified a food spoilage in the stores that would have sickened the crew within the week. "I noticed it when I arrived," Marin said. "It needed treating." "She took the blow at the pass," said another voice. "My arms master call, who was not a sentimental man. The wounded runner is my cousin's son. She stepped in front of him." "There were 3 of them," Marin said. "I could only shield one direction effectively, so I chose the direction that was already committed. The other runners had better odds of scatter." Call looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back at her with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating fighters and had just encountered a category he needed to rethink. "She calculated it," he said, "not a question." "Yes," I said, "she calculated it." Another silence. The inner wolves were arranged around her chair, and in the silence the wolf at her feet shifted, resettling, and the sound of it was the only thing in the room. "Well," said Aldrich, in the tone of a man who has revising something he said 3 weeks ago about border women with no standing, "the Northern Road expansion in Year 7 did make the scatter possible." "I mentioned that to him," Marin said. "He seemed surprised." "He rarely thinks about the roads as defensive infrastructure," Aldrich said. "He should," Marin said. "It's the most significant deterrent feature of the corridor." Aldrich looked at her. Something in his expression shifted the way Ossie's had, the old, quiet satisfaction of someone who has lived long enough to recognize the right thing arriving. "Well," he said again, "welcome to Valdenmoor. There is a thing that happens in kingdoms, in the days and weeks after a fated bond ignites, that the songs don't usually describe, because it isn't dramatic enough for songs. It is the gradual, quiet adjustment of everything. The way the inner wolves reroute their morning patrol to include the infirmary. The way Ossie begins annotating the keep's medical stores with Marin's preferred preparations, and the way those preparations turn out to be, in every case, more effective than what was there before. The way Aldrich starts sending the Northern Reach dispatches to Marin before they go to the full council, because she catches things, infrastructure things, supply chain things, the kind of practical ground-level detail that travels poorly up through the chain of reports, and the dispatch quality improves. The way the keep begins to learn her, the way she begins to learn the keep. She argued with me 4 times in the first month, which is more times than anyone had argued with me in the previous year combined, and in 3 of those 4 cases she was right and I adjusted my position, and in the 4th case we were both right about different aspects of the same question, and we reached a solution that neither of us would have reached alone. She found this entirely satisfactory. So did I. She continued to travel the northern settlements. Not alone. I won't pretend I had the composure for that, after Keldreth, and she was pragmatic enough to acknowledge that an escort was reasonable given the circumstances, but with a small team of wolves who quickly learned that their job was to carry her equipment and stay out of her way when she was working, and they adapted to this with a discipline I found somewhat gratifying. She treated a difficult birth in the first settlement she visited, north of Keldreth, that the local healer had been afraid to attempt. She was gone for 3 days, and I spent most of those 3 days being aggressively competent about dispatches, because competence was what I had, and she came back with mud on her boots and yarrow in her hair, and a very small carved wolf tucked under her arm. A gift from the family, she said, which she showed me with the careful neutrality of someone who was not accustomed to receiving gifts and wasn't entirely sure how to hold the feeling. "Put it on the table," I said. She put it on the table in my study. It sat there for the rest of the winter, and then for the spring after that, and I expect it will sit there long after both of us have stopped noticing it. The ceremony, what the pack calls the claiming, the formal acknowledgement before the full pack that the Alpha King has a mate, happened in the 4th week. I should tell you what I expected. The great hall, the wolves gathered, Marin standing beside me at the front of the room while the pack acknowledged what the bond had already said. What I expected, in other words, was formality, completion, the formal act that closes the circle the bond opened. What happened was, Ossie organized it, which meant it happened at noon rather than at night, because Ossie considered nighttime ceremonies impractical, and it happened in the great hall rather than the courtyard, because the weather was unfavorable, and it was smaller than I had imagined, not the full pack, but the inner pack, the keep residents, the council, the wolves, the people who had actually watched the thing happen. Marin wore blue, which was Ossie's doing, a deep gray blue that Ossie had produced from somewhere in the keep stores with an air of having been waiting for the right occasion. She looked like herself in it, which is to say she looked composed and precise and quietly amused by the formality of the whole thing. Aldrich read the traditional words. The wolves came forward, each in turn in the old sequence. Marin watched this with focused attention as she watched everything, and I thought, she is filing this, the way she files everything, organizing it, cataloging it, integrating it into her understanding of how Valdenmoor works. Then the inner wolves, all 11 of them, not just the 3, moved to her side, and the hall was very quiet. The claiming in the old form is simple. The Alpha King speaks his mate's name and she speaks his, and the pack witnesses, and that is the whole of it. I had known this form since I was a child. I had stood through 4 such ceremonies for other bonded pairs in my kingdom, and each time I had felt the gravity of it, the weight of the old language, the completeness of the thing. When I spoke her name in the hall, Marin, just that, just her name in the old form, she looked at me with the particular expression she used when she was revising her expectations upward, the small recalibration I had come to watch for. She spoke my name. The wolves bowed. I had governed Valdenmoor for 11 years. I had made every decision alone, because that was what I had, and I had built a kingdom that was worthy of its people. But the moment Marin spoke my name in the great hall, with the inner wolves of Valdenmoor arranged around her and 11 years of the compass needle finally, irrevocably still, I understood that I had been governing half a kingdom. The other half had been at the pine forest all along, waiting for me to come north. I said at the beginning that I had never knelt in the snow for anyone. What I should have said, what I have said to Marin in the 4th week and the 8th week, and in all the weeks since when the subject has come up, is that I had not, until that moment at Keldrath, encountered anyone who had earned it. She will tell you, if you ask her, that she did not do what she did at the pass because she expected anything back from it. She did it because the work was in front of her and she knew how to do it, which is what she always says, and which I believe completely, and which is also the most precise description of why she is who she is. What she did at Keldrath was not about me. It was not about the Bond or the Mark or the Alpha King riding north. She didn't know any of that was coming. She did what she did because 3 strangers were in trouble, and she was the only person in position to change that. But here is what I know, 11 years into running a kingdom alone. There is no more revealing portrait of a person than what they do when no one is watching, when there is no ceremony, no audience, no reward at the end, when the work is simply there and it needs doing, and they are the one who can do it. She stitched wounds in a way station no one asked her to stay in. She watched armed men through a full night to be sure of the count. She stepped into the road. When I found her in the snow, she asked if my runners were alive. I had spent 11 years looking for what I called, privately, the thing I was missing. Not a mate exactly, because I had decided I was not going to have one, but the thing that would make the kingdom feel finished, complete. The thing that all the road improvements and the supply route expansion and the 11 years of correct decisions had been trying to fill without ever quite filling. She was in the snow 2 miles northeast of the ambush site, packing her own wound with yarrow and spruce resin, and she asked if my runners were alive before she asked anything about herself, and I understood in that moment that the kingdom had never been missing infrastructure. It had been missing her. I knelt down beside her in the snow. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure she never has to ask if anyone is alive before someone has first asked after her. That is the whole of it. That is the story. She stepped into the road and I followed, and neither of us has stopped moving in the same direction since.